feature Benjamin Harrison. This program is about 2 hours.
On March 4, 1889, during an unremitting rainstorm, Grover Cleveland held an umbrella over Benjamin Harrison's head as they drove together in an open carriage on the way to the Capitol. Once there, Harrison was sworn in as the 23rd President of the United States. He had attained a majority of the electoral votes, 233 to Cleveland's 168, but only a minority of popular votes. Harrison was counted among the best orators of his day. During the campaign, when he lived in Indianapolis, citizens used to march down Delaware Street and congregate on his front lawn in order to hear him speak, usually extemporaneously from the front porch of his house. But he disliked small talk, and during intimate social gatherings appeared aloof. His political opponents proclaimed him a cold fish and said his handshake was like a wilted petunia. He began each day early with morning prayer. He often worked late, but when he had time, he enjoyed playing with his grandchildren on the lawn of the White House or taking walks around Washington. He also made a point of escaping the city every once in a while to indulge in his favorite pastimes, hunting and fishing. Public opinion turned against Harrison in 1890 when he supported the McKinley Tariff Act. The result of the passage of this law was a marked increase in consumer prices and may have been one of the reasons Harrison was not re-elected in 1892. Harrison was once quoted as saying, "There's a great sense of loneliness in the discharge of high public duties. The moment of decision is one of isolation." Harrison was born into a family devoted to public service on August 20, 1833, in North Bend, Ohio. His father, John, was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, was the 9th President of the United States. And his great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison V, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Harrison became actively involved in government beginning around 1854. A supporter of potential presidential candidates such as John C. Fremont, his involvement continued even during his service in the Civil War. Although he was a respected brigadier general, he disliked military life. "I am not a Julius Caesar nor a Napoleon," he wrote, "but a plain Hoosier colonel with no more relish for a fight than for a good breakfast, and hardly so much." After the war, Harrison took up practicing law again, and his enthusiasm for politics continued. In January of 1881, he was elected as a Republican to the U.S. Senate and served one term. In February 1888, he accepted the Republican presidential nomination by saying, "I am a dead statesman, but I am a living and rejuvenated Republican." Levi Morton of New York served as his running mate. His short stature, 5'6", led cartoonists to portray him as a diminutive man with an enormous hat, a suggestion that he was incapable of filling his grandfather's role. He was among the last of the 19th century statesmen to wear a beard, and was said to have dressed fashionably. The president's personal life became newspaper fodder, and Americans everywhere were fascinated to learn that the president wore a size 6.5 shoe and frequently purchased a dozen shirts at a time for $27. He married Caroline Scott on October 20th, 1853, when he was 20 and she was 21. They began dating in their teens, and by college were devoted to each other. In fact, Harrison spent so many evenings with Carrie, as she was called, that his friends nicknamed him Pious Moonlight Dude. As First Lady, Mrs. Harrison secured appropriations from Congress to renovate the White House. She started the tradition of a White House Christmas tree, as well as decorating state receptions with orchids. She designed her own White House china, and while in the White House, brought in an instructor to teach china painting classes to family and friends. Often ill, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis during her husband's unsuccessful re-election campaign and died on October 25, 1892. Following Caroline's death and his unsuccessful re-election bid, Harrison resumed practicing law in Indianapolis. Additionally, he wrote, lectured, and kept his hand in politics. Harrison shocked his 2 children when 3 years into his retirement, he remarried a woman almost half his age. The bride, Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, was a 37-year-old widow. She was also a niece of Caroline Harrison and had served as the First Lady's personal assistant. Harrison's children, Russell and Mary, did not attend the wedding. A year later, in 1896, a daughter, Elizabeth, was born. Not long after, the former president contracted the flu that eventually turned into pneumonia. He died in 1901 at the age of 67.
Located just down the street from the city center. He built this house in 1875. By that time, he had already been a city attorney in Indianapolis and a general in the Civil War. Later, he was a U.S. Senator. 1888, he upset the sitting president, Grover Cleveland. And of course, Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, our 9th president. So at the age of 7, he knew his Our phone lines being opened this morning. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen. We are in the back parlor of the house of Benjamin Harrison, and our guest is Charles Calhoun, who teaches history at East Carolina University. Hello to you.
Hello.
What did Benjamin Harrison look like?
Benjamin Harrison was about 5'6". He was slight in his younger years, had sandy hair, grew a beard during the Civil War, kept that beard all the rest of his life. He put on weight as time went on in the post-war years. I think he probably weighed in about 160, 165 in middle age and after.
Did he smoke?
He did smoke, as a matter of fact. In fact, one of the interesting stories about him when he was in college, he had a fairly strict upbringing, Presbyterian upbringing. His mother particularly was very attentive to his moral education. And when he went off to Farmers College near Cincinnati in Ohio, reports drifted back home that he was indulging in rather large cigars with some of his college mates, and this was considered, a real problem, and that his moral standing was on the ragged edge because of this. But I think he did continue to smoke moderately for the rest of his life.
Did he drink?
His upbringing again was fairly strict on that score. He was not a teetotaler. It was decided early in the presidency that wine would be served. Mrs. Harrison, Caroline Harrison, did get some letters from temperance supporters, WCTU types, Women Christian Temperance Union types, who wrote her and said, why can't you follow the example of Lucy Webb Hayes, who served no wine or liquors in the White House? But it was felt that for diplomatic entertaining and public receptions and state dinners that light wines would be perfectly acceptable, and Harrison did indulge. In fact, several years back, the Dewar's Scotch Company had a campaign ad. If you may remember, on the back of Slick magazines, there was a letter written from Andrew Carnegie to Benjamin Harrison sending him a case of Dewar's Scotch. And Harrison wrote back saying that, thank you very much for this, and in fact, I expect to be enjoying it over the next several months.
What's the biggest thing that happened, or most important thing that happened during his administration?
The most important thing that happened during his administration, I think, is a sort of a long-term thing. Rather than specifying a particular incident or event, and there were some quite important ones that I can mention, but I want to say something else first, and that is that in the late 19th century, the presidency itself, I think, was in a period of transition. It was, in a sense, in a period of recovery. We know that Andrew Johnson was impeached and nearly convicted, escaping conviction by just one vote in 1868. And what the subsequent presidents confronted was the task of rebuilding the presidency making it a forceful entity in the national government. And I think Harrison contributed to that. One of the things that I think is important about his presidency is that more than most previous presidents, he participated in the legislative process. We see with Harrison some laws, some bills being drafted in the White House, Harrison having congressmen and senators down to the White House for conferences, Harrison sending very well-timed messages up the Hill to push particular legislation or threaten a veto to sort of put his nuance on the crafting of some particular bill. So he's a participant in the legislative process much more. This is something I think that's been ignored in our understanding of the Harrison presidency, but I think that's one of the most important things to come out of it. Subsequent presidents, particularly William McKinley, will build on some of the things that Harrison did, and Theodore Roosevelt even more.
We'll learn about William McKinley on Monday. We're going to be in Canton, Ohio, at the William McKinley National Memorial Museum as our C-SPAN's American President Series continues. Our first call about Benjamin Harrison, however, is from Fallon, Nevada. Hello.
Hello there.
Go ahead. You're on with the professor.
Yeah, this is Gertrude Everly. Hello.
You're on the air. Go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. I live in Fallon, Nevada, and my grandmother, Jane Heckathorne Harrison, was Benjamin Harrison's cousin, and she was born in Ladoga, Indiana.
Who were her parents?
Allison Harrison was her father's name, and he was named Allison after Senator Allison of Indiana. Senator Allison was a very good friend of William Henry Harrison. And the little bit of the biography, the first Benjamin Harrison came to the United States in 1624. And when they talk about the genealogy from there on, they say they can't trace it any farther back. And it's alleged that Benjamin Harrison was involved in the murder of Charles II of England.
Charles Calhoun, do you know that story?
I don't know that story, but that certainly would not be a strike against him. The regicides were, of course, considered heroes by many, and it fits very well with the history of the Presbyterians who were against Charles.
In the library next to the room where we're sitting is a portrait of one of the early members of this family. Who is this?
That is Benjamin Harrison V. He is known, the fifth of the name, I believe, in colonial Virginia and the early United States. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a governor of Virginia soon after independence in the 1780s. A leader in Virginia politics, obviously a close associate of Washington. His son was, of course, William Henry Harrison, who achieved military fame and, of course, became president in 1841.
His portrait is over there. Now, Benjamin Harrison was 7 years old.
Correct.
He became...
his grandfather went off to the White House when he was 7. He served only 1 month, and not even his wife accompanied him. He caught cold and it developed into pneumonia and died April 4, 1841, just exactly 1 month after taking the oath of office. So there are no White House stories that Benjamin Harrison heard as a lad, perhaps White House dreams, but not stories.
We'll continue to take a look at the library area. Is this a place where Benjamin Harrison would have spent some time in this room?
Harrison was a lawyer here in Indianapolis.
That's his father there. Excuse me, I just want to make sure our viewers understand. That's the father on the right and the mother on the left. Go ahead.
Right, that's John Scott Harrison, the father, who was the son of William Henry Harrison. He had a homestead sort of carved out of William Henry Harrison's estate, about 600, 800 acres, was a farmer. Not the most successful farmer in the world, but well off enough to hire a tutor for his children and send them, at least some of them, to college.
Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, no, I'm sorry. Cincinnati, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I actually have 2 questions now. I wondered if the house you're in is accessible to people in wheelchairs.
That's a good question, and we will ask the executive director when she joins us in a little while.
Okay.
Your second question, sir?
My second question is, who's buried in Harrison's tomb in North Bend, Ohio?
Well, that is William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison is buried here in Indianapolis in Crown Hill Cemetery, with both his wives, by the way.
Greensburg, Pennsylvania, you're next. Good morning, Greensburg.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the house itself. I attended Arthur Jordan Conservatory in Indianapolis on North Delaware Street, and I thought that, my memory serves me right, Benjamin Harrison home was part of the campus of Arthur Jordan Conservatory. Can you enlighten me on that?
Well, we are at 12th and Delaware, right on the corner there.
You're absolutely correct. When the conservatory was here, this house, I understand, believe it or not, was used as a dormitory for female students there. It has been a museum only since the 1960s.
The bunting that you see on the outside of the house there is to celebrate the president's birthday. He would have been 166 years old. This is his birthday. And we'll take our next call is from Auburn, California. Hello.
That's me.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Well, I'm 79 years old, and I went to school at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, which is about 52 miles east of Cincinnati. And we had Benjamin Harrison went there, too, and we had a hall called Harrison Hall. I hope it's still there. I haven't been back there for 65 years, I guess.
I think we're going to be talking a little bit later this morning to one of the people who teaches at Miami University, and I think we have some video at that time we'll be showing you of Harrison Hall, but I think it's all still there, sir. Do you know anything more about that?
I think you're right. I think it is still there.
Erie, Pennsylvania, good morning.
Hi, good morning. My name is Louise Sutton, and I'm a direct descendant of William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison.
How are you related?
Through my grandmother, Edith Baker, from Harrison, Arkansas. And I have here I'm looking at a family tree, and I have that Carolyn Scott Harrison had the first Christmas tree in the White House. This is according to some genealogy from my grandmother. It was decorated.
One of the books I saw, yes, said that I think it's 1889 would have been.
It was decorated with gifts from every member of the family and the staff.
Right.
What did Carolyn Harrison bring to the White House?
Well, she was known as the nation's best housekeeper. What she brought to the White House was, actually one thing she brought to the White House were many members of her family. And I think that probably her most important contribution in the White House was, among many I might say, was a proposal to expand the White House. Previous families had discovered, once they moved in, that it actually was a fairly small edifice. And because the executive office was becoming more and more important within the United States government, you found that the offices were encroaching on the family residence area. By the time the Harrisons moved in, there were only 5 rooms available for bedrooms, and that actually was fewer bedrooms than there are in this house. So in a sense, the Harrisons were moving down, moving into the White House. So one of the things that she proposed was an expansion of the White House. She got together with an architect, Fred Owen, and they worked out several different alternatives. One was to build an entirely different executive mansion altogether. One was to expand it with 2 wings going out to either side, somewhat as later developed in the 20th century. A third proposal was to add wings that went around in a kind of quadrangle. One of the sides of the quadrangle would be devoted to offices. The other side would be devoted to an art museum reflecting Mrs. Harrison's great interest in art. And the back part of the quadrangle would be an expanded conservatory, botanical conservatory reflecting her interest in flowers. You can see her influence coming out here. It would have destroyed the the architectural integrity of the White House if this plan had gone through, and I think architectural historians and historians generally and the public at large, I think, have reason to be grateful for its not being approved. But what she did get was money to refurbish the building as it was. The residence was redone, some rooms reconfigured, making it more comfortable. A lot of the furniture and carpetings had gotten pretty shabby, and she was able to get some appropriations out of Congress to redo many things.
They were married 39 years. How did she die?
She died ultimately on October 25th of tuberculosis. We don't know exactly how it started. There are some theories that say, again back to her refurbishing of the White House, what got her into that and was part of her refurbishing of the White House was that she did a lot of the sort of exploring of the building herself, going up into the attics and down into the basements, and they had not been cleaned and taken care of. There were rats. In fact, a team of ferrets were brought in to get the rats out. But anyway, mold was everywhere, and some theories say that she just made herself sick doing this kind of thing in this kind of noxious atmosphere. But she became fairly gravely ill as early as spring of 1892. It got worse as time went on. She was taken to the Adirondacks where the air was clear. Of course, sanitaria up there were considered the thing to do to help tubercular patients, but it did not really help her much. And she, in September, asked to be returned to the White House, and she was. And she did die in the White House.
Campaign was going on?
The campaign was going on. It was something of a lackluster campaign anyway. The rule of thumb was that a sitting president should not campaign, and so Harrison would not really have been out on the hustings much anyway, asking for re-election. His opponent, Grover Cleveland, was not a very enthusiastic public speaker, didn't much like it. He made a couple of speeches. So as far as the participation of the two main principals was concerned, they did not participate much, and so her death simply put another damper on that.
This house is full of clocks. We've heard the top of the hour beaming around as we will show you some of them as we take our next call from St. Louis. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
I'd like to ask your guest if he would comment upon two controversial efforts of Benjamin Harrison in his later life. First of all, in 1900, he refused to campaign for McKinley because he was opposed to the Philippine intervention. And the second one is he became very much involved in the liberal fundamentalist controversy of the Presbyterian Church nationally, and was, I think, an ardent supporter of the more modernist point of view. And I'd appreciate if he could comment upon both of those efforts on his part. Thank you.
On the McKinley question, Harrison did not have a great deal of affection for McKinley in the 1890s, even before McKinley's presidency. McKinley's name had been entered against Harrison's name at both Republican National Conventions where he was nominated, and it was particularly galling that this happened when he was sitting in the White House. Of course, McKinley did not defeat him for the nomination, but they did not get along terribly well when Harrison was in the White House. They agreed a lot on policies, domestic policies, but you're absolutely correct. The central point of contention between the two men toward the end of the century was the imperialist thrust engineered by McKinley. McKinley, of course, we had the Spanish-American War. One of the results of that was the acquisition of some island possessions. And one of the central questions was, does the protection of the Constitution extend to the people living in those island protections? The government more or less said no. Harrison thought that was a mistake. And he generally opposed the imperialist thrust in broader terms because he thought it was a kind of aggressive commercialism that was overtaking the country that really sort of belied the country's more fundamental democratic values. This is despite the fact that during his own administration, at the very end, he welcomed the annexation of Hawaii. That was not completed before his term was up, and in fact Hawaii was not annexed until 1898 at the time of the Spanish-American War. As far as Harrison's religion is concerned, he was a deeply religious man. He had a strong religious training from his mother. Miami University, where he completed his degree, spent his last 2 years in college, was Presbyterian dominated. In fact, as a young man there, he was weighing the merits of becoming a minister as opposed to becoming a lawyer. He eventually opted to become a lawyer, but it's interesting, in his papers there are many of his college essays that are still extant, and some of the debates he engaged in. He wrote his arguments out, and one of the speeches he made to his college debating society talked about how becoming a lawyer wasn't an evil thing. We ought not to think of lawyers as simply corrupt people, that they can pursue God's work in that trade as well as others. Some people might disagree with that, but I think he convinced himself that that was the case. So late in life, he did, you're correct, he did tend to favor those views that you were speaking of, and he was active in his church at the very end, and when he died, his church had a very elaborate and heartfelt commemorative service.
Benjamin Harrison was the fourth president born in Ohio, but he moved here to Indiana. It's fair to say he was a Hoosier?
I think he would definitely claim Hoosierhood.
Hoosierhood?
Hoosierhood,
If you go downtown in Indianapolis, big statue to him.
Oh, yes. And that was erected after his death in 1908. There was around the turn of the century, there was, or about 1902, there was a readings at one of the local opera houses by a series of readings by Indiana authors, and this was done to raise money to build that statue. And I think people in Indiana, and certainly Indianapolis, claim him as a favorite son and a favored son. When he left Indianapolis to go to the White House, he gave a very, I think, heartfelt talk to people as he was leaving from the back of the train, saying, "I love this city, and I look forward to coming back." As far as Mrs. Harrison is concerned, I think Indianapolis represented the happiest time in her life. She enjoyed her painting here, her social activities through her church. So they are very much part of this city.
She never came home.
She never came home.
Sumter, South Carolina. Go ahead.
Yes, my wife is kin to Elizabeth Lord, and she was a great-great-great-grandmother, married Peter Robinson, which Robinson County, North Carolina, is named after. And I was wondering if you know of any connection with this Mary Lord, where her descendants, where she originated from, I think.
Well, that brings us to the next wife.
Right. I'm not sure I can answer the gentleman's question about the connection between Mary Lord and his relative, but Mary Lord Dimmick was Benjamin Harrison's second wife. She was quite a bit younger than the ex-president. She was a niece of the first Mrs. Harrison. She was the daughter of Mrs. Harrison's sister. Mrs. Harrison, the first Mrs. Harrison, when she moved into the White House, found the entertaining obligations of her job quite stressful, and she asked her daughter and daughter-in-law to participate, and she had a couple of her nieces come on board too. And so Mary Lord Dimmick, who was a widow, by the way, about in her 30s, spent much time in the White House, lived there part of the time, a good bit of the time, and helped with the entertaining. When Mrs. Harrison I became ill, Mary Lord Dimmick helped nurse her, went to the Adirondacks, and was on hand to do that kind of duty. After the president left the White House, he came back to this house, and of course, as one might expect, it was a very lonely place without his beloved wife. And Mrs. Dimmick lived in New York. Harrison's law practice took him to New York quite often, and he called on Mrs. Dimmick, and they had something of a courtship, and grew fonder and fonder of each other. And around Christmas time of 1895, they announced that they were going to be married, and were married the following spring.
Controversial?
It was controversial. because she was so much younger than he, and the two children by Caroline Harrison were quite distressed by this. They felt that this was an unsuitable match, that it was inappropriate for the ex-president to do this at his age. But there's a wonderful letter from Benjamin Harrison to his son Russell saying, the house is empty, I'm lonely, I don't want to be alone, and she comforts me, and we're going to be married.
So at age 61, he became the father of his last child.
Actually, he was 63.
63.
And yes, Elizabeth Harrison was born in the spring of 1897, and she later became a lawyer, prominent citizen, and he loved her dearly. She was an adorable child. And I can't help but think that she brightened the latter years of his life very much.
She died when?
I'm not sure of her death date. I think she lived into the 1940s or 50s.
New Orleans, Louisiana. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask the professor what he knows about concerning the early years of Benjamin Harrison and his family in their relationship and contact with their relatives in Virginia, and what types of things were the relatives in Virginia doing at that time. I guess that would be the Berkeley area.
Caller, you seem to know a little bit about this. Maybe you can help us begin this.
Well, I think, well, yeah, I do know something about this, but I don't really think I should stay right here because I don't want to start controversy. I'd just like to get some information to help me do some research that some things that I have heard in my family my entire life, and so I'm just trying to get a little bit more information.
Okay, you make this a little difficult for us. Professor Calhoun, is there anything that you can shed light on?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know a whole lot about what the Harrisons in Virginia were doing, but I'd be interested to hear what that controversial matter might be if you care to share it with us.
He's already gone.
Okay.
You went through the papers of Benjamin Harrison.
I beg pardon?
You went through the papers of Benjamin Harrison.
Yes, the papers of Benjamin Harrison are in the Library of Congress. Mm-hmm. They're quite voluminous. They're his personal papers. He obviously, as an up-and-coming politician in Indiana and as a national figure throughout the 70s and much more so in the 80s, he wrote letters extensively in his political career. Of course, there are legal papers as well. The White House papers are quite extensive, and including scrapbooks that the White House staff collected, and so they have quite a good coverage of his career.
Charles Calhoun is a history professor at East Carolina University. He's written a couple books about this Gilded Age era, and he's written quite a bit about Benjamin Harrison. We are in the home of Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, Indiana, as we take a look at this 23rd president. And what we're going to be doing next is talking a little bit with Phyllis Giesland. She is the executive director of the President Benjamin Harrison home. Phyllis Giesland, as we've been talking a little bit about the papers of some of these people, what happened to the papers of Caroline, the wife?
Well, I think probably many of them stayed with Ben's papers. We have quite a few, however, right here in the home, and even some of Ben's papers here in the home. So we have a wonderful research library, and it's kind of completes the picture with the papers that are in Washington.
Do we know anything about her diaries?
Yes, we do. Very interesting little story. About a year and a half ago, on the front doorknob of the house, we found a big plastic bag, and it was full of items that had been taken from the home by a previous curator here, and one of the items was her White House diary, which we did not even know existed. We were so thrilled to get it back and have had a great deal of interest in going through it and have been able to establish that some stories we had heard are true and then gotten some different ideas as well.
Did you ever find out who put that on the doorknob?
Yes, there was a confession on it, and actually it was the daughter of the people who had taken it who said she had found it in her mother's things, and thought it belonged here, and we were certainly grateful.
What room are you in?
Today, right now, I'm in the dining room, and I welcome you here. This is a wonderful room and held lots and lots of wonderful evenings and parties for the Harrisons. The china that is on the table, it was a gift to the Harrisons when they lived in the White House. It's a Haviland pattern. And it's hard to talk in this room without talking about Caroline, because she loved to entertain and she was a gracious hostess. She also loved to cater to her husband's loves in food, and one of the things he loved were oysters. And you see a plate of oysters on the table because Ben just would have had them at every meal.
Now let me try to put these two people together. We've got Carolyn Harrison, who is the entertainer, and then we have Benjamin Harrison, who had the nickname of being the human iceberg. Charles Calhoun, how does that work?
Well, you know,
fair?
I suppose part of it is that old saying that opposites attract, but Carolyn really was very good for Ben in that from the word go, when they first met, she brought him out of himself more. She liked to dance, and he wasn't particularly fond of that activity, but she made him go to parties and really, I think, helped him with his social skills. He was a very studious individual, hardworking as a student. His first state job was as a reporter of the Supreme Court. He practically collapsed. He worked at it so hard to make money for his family, to get them on their feet. But she said, slack off, you know, take it easy a little bit, enjoy life a little more. Wonderful letters during the Civil War from Harrison to his wife saying, you know, when I come home, I'm going to take your advice. I'm not going to work as hard as I have because it's just not right to you and the children, and I'll be better for you in the future. Of course, when he came home, he practically collapsed on that job I was talking about. It was in his blood. But she here in Indianapolis in the home would invite people in. They had a readings club, and of course she did her artwork and had displays of her artwork, shows that she participated in. Harrison would attend them. So she brought him out of himself, I think.
Phyllis Geeslin, one of the earlier callers mentioned the fact that she brought the first Christmas tree to the White House. What else did she bring to the White House that you can show us in that room?
Well, one of the things that she did while she was in the White House was design her own White House china. She did china painting here in Indianapolis. She took her china painting instructor to Washington with her, and actually he remained in Washington when the Harrisons were out of the White House and never came back. But you can see on the top shelf is her White House china. She loved the eagle on Lincoln's plates, which are on the second shelf, so she used that. She surrounded that with 44 stars, one for each state. And then on the cobalt blue border, she has featured corn. In a letter to her daughter, she said it was indigenous to this country.
So the top, the one there, that one we're looking at right now is the one that has the corn on the outside, and that was the Harrisons. Now can we go down and take a look at the one lower than that? What is that?
This is the Lincoln china. Mrs. Lincoln, you know, loved purple. And so her china was purple.
Why did Mrs. Harrison end up with the Lincoln china?
I think that Mrs. Lincoln ordered voluminous amounts of china, and there seemed to be quite a bit of it that was given away. You know, until Mrs. Harrison moved in, they did not retain the china. And so I would have to credit Caroline Harrison as being the person to start the first archival collection in the White House, and that would have been presidential china.
As we look around this home today, Phyllis Geeslin, we're going to be taking a much more extensive look at it, but how much of this is original?
Well, really, the furnishings are almost 85% original. We're quite fortunate in that regard.
And we're going to be taking a little bit of a look at this later. Charles Calhoun, how important was the idea of Abraham Lincoln? How much of a force was he still around in this Harrison presidency?
Well, his legacy remained with the Republican Party for a long time. The Republican Party, election after election, projected itself as the party that saved the Union and emancipated the slaves. And they would cling to that image as long as they could and use it effectively in politics. The Lincoln clubs were established around the country, one in New York City. They would invite every year the annual Lincoln Club address. Some of the major politicians in the United States would, of the Republican Party would address that club. His portrait would grace every Republican National Convention, of course.
And it was one in this home, right next door to us. I mean, next to Harrison's portrait is Abraham Lincoln's. His is the only non-family one in the whole room.
And when, of course, at the end of the war, when Lincoln was assassinated, and soon after Benjamin Harrison and his troops were mustered out, when he came back to Indianapolis, he gave a very important speech and heartfelt speech about the president and what they had fought for and what the results of the war should be. And the accomplishments of Lincoln were very much a part of that.
Next call is from Riverside, California. You're on with Phyllis Giesland and Charles Calhoun.
Good morning.
Morning.
I would like to know if there are any family reunions in or around the home site, and how many people would attend this?
Phyllis Giesland, excuse me.
I know that we did have a reunion in the late 1980s. Probably we will need to do that again in 1901. We actually do have some relatives in a short distance. A few of them live in Chicago. But as for having the entire family together, we have not done that since the late 1980s.
Phyllis Giesland, an earlier caller, also asked about the handicap accessibility to this house.
At this time, the handicap accessibility is simply first floor. But we have just received a wonderful grant from the Nina Pulliam Trust to install an elevator to all floors in the house.
How many people visit here every year?
About 30,000 people.
When is it open?
We are open 7 days a week and are closed 9 holidays, so you would want to call if you wanted to come on a holiday and be sure we are open that day.
What does it cost to go through it?
$5 for adults, $4 for seniors, $1 for students, and little preschoolers are free.
Rockville, Maryland, you're next. Hello.
Hello. Hello. This is Margaret Jellin from Rockville. I have 2 questions. When pensions were awarded to Civil War veterans, did the Confederate veterans receive them? And also a good biography of Benjamin Harrison.
Thanks very much. Mr. Calhoun, first the pension issue.
The pension question. That's a good question. The pensions that were awarded by the United States government were awarded only to people who served to defend the United States government. So federal pensions were limited to people who served in the Union Army. As far as Confederate pensions were concerned, several of the, if not all of the former Confederate states did engage in some pension programs for their former troops. A good biography, I can recommend a couple of things to you. One is a 3-volume work by Father Harry J. Sievers. This is called Benjamin Harrison, and each volume has a different subtitle. It came out in the 1950s and 1960s. And secondly, I can recommend to you a study of the presidency itself called The Presidency of Benjamin Harrison. And this is by Homer Sokolowski and Alan Spetter, published by the University Press of Kansas.
Phyllis Giesland, do you think very much has been written about the Harrisons?
Nothing about Caroline, really, except a chapter in other books about the First Ladies. That's probably a book that should be written. The 2 biographies that Dr. Calhoun mentioned certainly are good ones. We also have a children's series by Rita Stevens that we sell in our gift shop that is for younger readers.
Petaluma, California, you're next. Good morning.
My name is Judy Metcalf, and I'm sorry to say that I've come in a little bit late on this show. I need to ask you a question. My grandpa, his name is Wesley Harrison Gibson. His grandparents' names were Simeon Gibson, who married Sarah Ann Harrison. I'm having a hard time finding any information on Sarah Ann.
Phyllis Giesland.
We do have Benjamin Harrison's genealogy here at the home in our computer, and we are happy to help people when we can with this sort of information. You would really want to call our curator, Jennifer Capps, and ask her the question, or write us a letter, or email us, and we will be happy to work with you. There is a small charge for the computer-generated papers.
Now this becomes probably a little confusing because both, I think, it wasn't Benjamin Harrison's parents, there were 2 marriages there, and then of course he was married twice, so there's lots of families out there.
Right, right.
How do you keep it all straight?
Well, we can't, but we do concentrate on Ben and Mary Lord and Caroline, and we feel as if we've done a pretty good job with them.
Now, the other thing I noticed going through here is there's lots of Marys.
Oh, so many Marys, so many Elizabeths.
How did they handle that when they were all alive and together in the same family?
Well, of course, many of the Marys were called Mamie, and I suppose they had some little trick, the way we all do in our own families, of nicknames or something like that.
Next is Bethesda, Maryland. Hello.
Hello. There was a Benjamin Harrison that was mayor of Chicago. Any relation to the presidents?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't get the first part of your question.
There was a Benjamin Harrison who was mayor of Chicago. Any relation to the presidents?
When was he mayor, do you know?
Mayor, no, I don't know.
I think you may be referring to Carter Harrison, who I believe was a cousin of Benjamin.
Right.
And how far removed, do you know, Philip Kieslin?
I just know that he was a cousin.
Okay, Somerville, South Carolina is next. Good morning.
Yes, my question was, I've been listening to, oh, hold on for a second. I had to turn off the volume. I've been watching the series, and I've become very interested in everything that's gone on, and I remember listening to Grover Cleveland that there was a depression in the early 1890s, and I was curious as if Harrison's policies during his administration helped create this depression that had happened, or was it just a series of happenings and it just resulted?
Professor
Thank
Calhoun.
you. I'll hang up.
Well, it's probably a mixture of those two. The United States at that time was, believe it or not, involved in the world economy to a degree in a couple of ways. First through trade, and second through the fact that much of the investment that took place in this country still came from Great Britain. And in 1890, a very important English bank failed, Baring Brothers, and that had a ripple effect that eventually hit the United States and contributed to money stringency here. But there are other factors involved as well. The Harrison policies, whether they contributed to the Depression or not, is I think an open question and debatable among historians. One of the pieces of legislation that was passed during Harrison's administration was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which mandated that the Secretary of the Treasury would buy virtually all of the silver production of the United States. Actually, the figure was set at 4.5 million ounces per month, and that in exchange for this silver, the Treasury Department would issue certificates, Treasury notes. The problem was that those Treasury notes were redeemable in either gold or silver at the Treasury. And as people got worried about their financial status, they began to go to the Treasury to take gold out. And that contributed to a money stringency. Secondly, the McKinley Tariff Act also, because it lowered tariff rates on sugar, particularly, in fact eliminated the tariff rate on sugar altogether, which had been the great source of revenue from for the federal government. That cut down the gold supply in the Treasury, as did the fact that the McKinley Tariff Act tended to raise other tariff rates tremendously high, so that there were no tariffs collected at all on many items because they weren't imported. The point is that the Treasury itself entered into a period when it was The money was draining out, the reserves were getting low. It was thought by businessmen in the country that $100 million in gold in the Treasury was sort of a magical floor. And if the Treasury went below that, then the country would be in serious trouble. As the Harris administration wound down, it got close to that. And soon after Grover Cleveland took over, it went below that. Republicans, after the 1892 election, many of them, if you read their private correspondence, allege that one of the reasons that the Depression comes on as rapidly as it does was the very fact that Grover Cleveland was elected. Why? Well, because Grover Cleveland ran on a low-tariff platform. And many manufacturers around the country said, we have hard times coming ahead, because Cleveland not only won the presidency in '92, but he had a Congress elected as well, a Democratic Congress. The fear was that the McKinley tariff, which protected American industries, was going to be altered seriously. So businessmen became very conservative in their decisions. That had a ripple effect through the economy. And again, many of these Republican senators and others making this lament say that this contributed to the problem.
During the Harrison presidency, it was the first Congress to appropriate $1 billion.
Correct. It was called the $1 billion Congress by its adversaries, the Democrats, and that was a campaign slogan that was used against the Republicans. They're wasting too much money. The $1 billion Congress is a drain on the country. Taxes are too high, et cetera, et cetera. And it had a telling effect in the off-year elections, the midterm elections in Harrison's administration, 1890, where the Republicans saw their majority in the House of Representatives, which had been about 10 or 12 majority, cut down tremendously. After the 1890 elections, it was 88 Republicans to 235 Democrats in the House. It was devastating. But this is part of the activism the Republicans believed in. What did they spend the money on? Well, they spent it on veterans' pensions. Veterans' pensions went from around 80 million a year to about 135 million a year at the end of Harrison's administration. They spent it on the Navy. This is a time in which the United States is enlarging the Navy. This, by the way, is a bipartisan effort. It had started significantly under Arthur. Grover Cleveland continued it in his first term. Harrison continued it with his Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Tracy, and they're moving into the area of creating battleships as well as big cruisers because the world's becoming a more dangerous place as imperialism spreads out from Europe, the new imperialism, and the American leaders think they need to be able to react. And other kinds of expenditures, mail subsidies. One of the things the Republicans felt the United States should do was to try to get the merchant marine of the country back in the water, that American goods should be carried in American-owned and American-registered vessels. And how could the government help? Well, it could subsidize steamship companies that carried foreign mail. And it might be just one bag thrown on the deck, but the Republicans said, let's help them with a significant expenditure because that will inspire businessmen to recreate our fleets. The fleets, of course, the merchant fleets, have been destroyed during the Civil War or put under other flags.
Albuquerque, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask about Indian affairs. What was his position on Indians, Native Americans, and also foreign affairs? Anything happen? I heard that we may have already almost gone to war against Chile. Could you talk more about that?
Well, you raised two very important questions. First, Indian affairs. The policy in place at the time Benjamin Harrison became president was the Dawes Severalty Act, passed in 1887. And that was the policy that basically said we're going to try to move the Indians into a kind of existence similar to the white settlers who were moving among them. We're going to subdivide their reservations and in the process, of course, deprive them of a large section of their lands. But the idea was that each Indian would get 160 acres and they would create a life as farmers. And of course, this was a policy that largely slighted the notion that we're dealing with another culture here, and essentially what the policy was to change the culture of these people, and that I think most people are agreed now was a real mistake. Of course, the single most important event, perhaps in many ways, regarding Indian policy during Harrison's administration was the Wounded Knee episode, December 29, 1890.
What was his feeling on that?
Well, his feeling, I think, was that it was one of the most regrettable things that could happen. This, of course, was when the ghost dance was participated in by some Indians who were unwilling to accept the new policy. The Indian Wars had been lost by the Indians, and they were looking for a kind of spiritual way to revive themselves. And the ghost dance was begun by a prophet named Wovoka, who basically was the basis of his teaching was, do this ritual and the gods will come help us and restore us to our power and defeat the whites. To white settlers and army officials out in the West, this was considered threatening, and the conflict came to a head at Wounded Knee, where over 100 Indians were massacred, men, women, and children. A disastrous kind of episode. Harrison, probably one of the most, alas, discreditable things that he said in one of his annual messages was that, whereas this is a regrettable thing, but Nelson Miles, who was a commander, not on the scene, but of the department, did all he could to reduce the hostiles to subjection with as little loss of life as possible. And I think most of us would say probably more lives were lost than necessary.
6 states that were admitted during the Harrison presidency: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all became states during the Harrison presidency. Promise you we'll get to that chili question, but we need to keep moving on our calls, and we'll get back to that one. Orange, California, good morning. Orange, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Ken.
My first question is, how was Harrison able to defeat Cleveland and in turn become defeated by Cleveland? Because this is a unique phenomenon. And the second question is just, I'd like to know what Harrison did, if anything, to try to stop the segregation that occurred in the South during this period.
2 very good questions. How did he win and then lose? One thing I would point out to folks is that the political parties at that time, roughly from the mid-'70s to the mid-'90s, were very evenly balanced. If you stacked up every Republican and every Democrat, you'd have 2 lines practically equal in length. What that meant was that any given presidential election was practically a toss-up. They were all very close. And so pinpointing any reason why one went one way and one went the other, you can sort of choose among your reasons and say that's it. I think that part of the reason that he won, and a major part of the reason he won in 1888, was the participation of Harrison himself. Tradition held that presidential candidates ought not to do much in a presidential campaign once they had received the nomination. James G. Blaine, 4 years earlier, had taken a campaign trip that ended somewhat disastrously when some remarks were made at the end that hurt his chances by someone who was at a meeting with him. Harrison decided he would not take such a campaign trip, that was too risky. What he did was to stay in Indianapolis, and visiting delegations would come to the House. They would come from places around in Indiana. They might be veterans groups or laboring groups or whatever. They came from neighboring states as well. And Harrison's lieutenants very neatly organized this, and the chairman of this group would make a little speech, and Harrison would then respond. In fact, the speech was probably gone over the chairman's speech by one of Harrison's men in advance to make sure that person didn't say anything really stupid. And then Harrison would he could speak off the cuff very easily. He would respond. A stenographer was there, taking it down, handed out the copies to reporters. The next morning, it was in all the newspapers around the country.
Phyllis Giesland, what was it like to have basically a presidential campaign directed from this house?
I think it must have been amazing. And the very first night that the Harrisons welcomed people to their front yard, the crowd was so excited and so happy that Benjamin Harrison had been nominated that they wanted a souvenir, and the picket fence that was all around the front yard disappeared by the time they all left. Mrs. Harrison was aghast that this would happen. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that Benjamin Harrison added the porch after he came back from the White House. So when we're talking about a front porch campaign, we're really probably talking more about a front stoop campaign, because that was not there. The other thing that I think is remarkable is that the Harrisons then opened the front door, and all the people that were out in the yard marched through and out the side door, and they shook hands with everyone.
When this caller's second question was about segregation, Mr. Calhoun.
Yes. Harrison, as we were mentioning earlier, was a Civil War veteran. He took the results of the war very seriously. And when he was in the White House, by the time he was elected president, the conservative Democrats of the South had pretty much eliminated the, voting by, not totally, there were pockets, but had pretty much eliminated voting by black citizens in the South. There were federal laws on the books to protect voting in the South, but they were ineffective. What we see during Harrison's administration, and he laid this out in his campaign and in his inaugural address, is that we ought to do something more to protect the right to vote. This was the key issue for Harrison, because he believed that if a citizen could vote, he could protect himself. And so Henry Cabot Lodge and Senator George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts, John Coit Spooner of Wisconsin, developed legislation that would have toughened the federal election laws for congressional elections only. There was not to be any interference with state elections. This law passed the House of Representatives quite narrowly on 155 to 149. It went over to the Senate, and there, alas, it did fail. So Harrison lamented this. Harrison also was the first president to denounce lynching, which became a real problem in the 1890s. But again, what could he do as president? The federal system, where we have a national government and a state government, lynching was essentially a state concern, but Harrison did denounce it, using, in a sense, the White House as a bully pulpit to say this is wrong.
On the phone now is Douglas Shumavon. He teaches at Miami University. Mr. Shumavon, what is the connection between Benjamin Harrison and Miami University?
Well, he, of course, was a graduate in 1852 of Miami University, and from here launched his political career after studying law and then moving to Indianapolis.
What kind of legacy of Benjamin Harrison is left at Miami?
Well, I speak to you from Harrison Hall, which houses the political science department at the university, and we also have a scholarship in Harrison's name that brings exceptionally bright students to the campus who have potential to have an impact on society in their field of study or in their community, much as Benjamin Harrison did.
What do they have to do to apply for that scholarship?
Well, the application process is much as application to the university. There is a special form, there are additional essays, and then there is a rather arduous process of interviews for finalists to select about 10 to 15 scholars a year.
What is Harrison's legacy at Miami University?
Well, I think I think there are two things that I've uncovered about him that stand out. One of those is his considerateness to people that were helpful around him, and the other is his industriousness in many of the activities that he had here as a student, and that carried him forth later on in his military career and in his political career.
Now, just to put this in context, about how far away are you away from Indianapolis?
We are, by today's standards, about an hour and a half to 2 hours by car. We are probably about 25 minutes north of Cincinnati. Again, by today's standards of automobiles, I'm not sure what it would have taken on buckboard or horse.
Do you have a question for our guest, by the way, before we let you go?
I'd just like to know, for Professor Calhoun, I understood that there was an authorized biography at one point that got started, but was never completed. You might have mentioned this earlier, and I was not able to listen to the whole program, but what happens to something like that when a scholar such as yourself gets involved in research?
You're absolutely right. There was to be an authorized biography. The second Mrs. Harrison had worked with an historian named Albert Vollweiler, to whom she gave access to the president's papers, and he also received some grants from various foundations to pursue this scholarly project, and alas, never did finish it. In some ways, that's doubly unfortunate. We don't have his book, but he also was in possession of the papers for a time, so that other scholars were held back from pursuing this important subject, and it was not until Father Sievers had access to the papers that he could go forward with this. The one thing that Vollweiler did publish, which is useful to historians, is a collection of the letters of Harrison and James G. Blaine, his Secretary of State, not just during their White House years, but before, during their political careers as well. So it is unfortunate that Vollweiler didn't finish it, but fortunately Father Sievers did come along, and quite frankly, I think there's ample need for another single-volume biography of Harrison. I think he's an overlooked president. Henry Adams said in The Education of Henry Adams that Harrison was the best man that the Republicans had nominated since Lincoln, and it was with typical Henry Adams perversity, he voted for Grover Cleveland that year anyway, but it was, I think it bespoke the abilities that Harrison had, and I think we've overlooked them.
Dr. Shumavon, thanks for joining us from Miami University. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Certainly. We're going to ask Phyllis Giesland to go ahead and come on into the back parlor, where we're going to crank up the old Regina phone and find out a little bit more about that. As she comes in, though, let's take this call from Marble Falls, Texas. Hello. Texas, are you there?
Yes.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. This is probably not relevant to much, but was Benjamin Harrison, was he in relationship to Tippy Canoe?
Yes, indeed. That was his grandfather. William Henry Harrison was Benjamin Harrison's grandfather.
Are they the only grandfather-grandson duo in the presidency?
As of today. That's correct.
Phyllis Giesland, we've stopped you here just for a second because of this specific spot in the house. Why is that important?
This is a very important spot in the house between the front parlor and the back parlor. This is where the committee asked Benjamin Harrison to run for president, the Republican Party.
And when did that happen?
In 1888.
Mr. Calhoun, was he happy about that?
Well, he had worked for it. We have this notion that the office seeks the man, but the man certainly seeks the office, even perhaps especially in that period. But the Republican National Convention had been meeting for more than a week, not reaching a decision until Monday morning, June 25, and 1888. And then a special committee was deputed to come here to the House to tell him the results, not that he didn't know already. Interesting story is, in that parlor, Mrs. Harrison on that Monday morning was with the daughter, Mamie, and they were looking outside. And then all of a sudden they noticed around the middle of the day the crowds forming, and some people already sort of carving up part of the picket fence. And Mrs. Harrison turned to Mamie and she said, "Well, Mamie, your father's got it," meaning, of course, the presidential nomination. Harrison was downtown at his law office, and the story is that when it came across the telegraph that he'd gone over the top in the balloting, he almost fainted. But he sort of recovered himself and came home and greeted the crowd.
What was the family's reaction to all of this?
Well, I think they were quite excited about it. I think it was a little hard for Caroline to understand the enormous attention that they got, and especially in Washington. She was a little intimidated by that. But she became used to it and seemed to eventually enjoy it.
Now, when this event happened, how old were the children?
Actually, the children were grown. Mary was married and had 2 little children, and Russell was also married and had 1 child.
So there were no little children running around the White House in terms of this house, excuse me.
Yes, actually there were, because it seemed that all the family would come to visit often, and the grandchildren, of course, would always be here with them.
His second marriage?
Yes.
He brought his second wife back here then? Were they ever at the White House?
No, they were not married until he had been home for 3 years. And then they were married in 1896 and had their daughter in 1897.
So there was a 43-year gap between the oldest son and the youngest?
That was true.
And there was also, I understand, the fact that his children were let me see, his children were younger than his grandchildren? If that would have been possible, right?
Well, that's true.
One child at least.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You're going to show us the Regina phone. What is it?
I would love to. It's a musical instrument that was common in this period of time.
Is this original to the house?
Actually, this is not. But the family loved music, and particularly Caroline loved music. She played the piano and was accomplished. She also taught.
Can you stop that for just a minute? I don't know. Can you stop it?
I can't.
Oh, you can't. Once it starts, huh? We'll just listen to it then.
It will stop itself. You recognize the Sousa March.
What was the significance of Sousa to the Harrison administration?
Actually, John Philip Sousa came to the White House several times when the Harrisons lived there. He loved the marching music, and it was such a patriotic form of music. So, and they did have Sousa for the inaugural parade, and of course played Sousa marches for the inaugural parade.
Importance of music to the family?
Mrs. Harrison played the piano. Elizabeth played the violin. I think in the evening they would stand around the piano and sing.
Want to crank it up one more time for us as we take our
break?
We are going to listen to a little more, and we'll be back in just a few moments with more of the life of Benjamin Harrison, our 23rd president. www.americanpresidents.org is the website that you can go to get more information about our American President series. And also, we have a C-SPAN in the Classroom project that we want to tell you a little bit about. It's how you can use all of this American President series in your classroom. If you would like to get information about it and you're a teacher, just call 202-626-4858. Again, you see that number on your screen, 202-626-4858. We're encouraging teachers who might want to use this series and the information in it in their classrooms to give us a call. It's all free. You are not obligated in any way. If you'd like to give us a call and get some more information about that, and again, that's for teachers only. In 1875, Benjamin Harrison had this house built for him in Indianapolis, Indiana. That is where we're based today. About 100,000 people lived here in the city at the time, and we're back with our second portion of our series and program on our 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison. Up on the second floor is Phyllis Geeslin. She is the executive director of this home. Phyllis Geeslin, how big is this house in general, so we can just get a little bit of a feel for it?
It has 16 rooms, Connie.
Is that big for that era?
I think it probably is a moderately large house, and the rooms were large. Each room was large, so I think that made it different.
Were the Harrisons wealthy people?
By the standards of the time, I believe they were.
Where are you now?
Right now I'm still in the dressing room, and as we walk out to go into the bedroom, I do want to just mention that Caroline Harrison, when she moved in the White House, was thrilled because Mrs. Hayes' greenhouse grew orchids, and she became fascinated with them, and they became the subjects of many of her pictures.
Meaning she was an artist herself?
Yes, yes, and not just China painting, but painting of all kinds. And these orchids in this room are just exceptional.
And in the back of you there, a couple cradles. Whose are they?
This is William Henry Harrison's cradle, which he used in Vincennes, Indiana, when he was the territorial governor, and his children were in it, including Benjamin Harrison's father. The other crib belonged to Benjamin Harrison when he was a baby, and then he brought it here, and his children and his grandchildren used it. It's a beautiful little canopied type bed, and it could have been covered with a decorative item, or it could have been covered with a fine fabric to keep out flies or to make it a little warmer in the winter.
Who's the portrait on the wall?
The portrait on the wall is Benjamin Harrison McKee, Harrison's oldest grandson. Benjamin Harrison McKee lived in the White House with them, and he was quite a favorite of Benjamin's. They would often spend time together during the day in the White House and even out on the White House lawn.
You know, there have been so many calls today about people who want to ask about descendants of the Harrison family. Is there any kind of registry, or do you make any kind of organization out of the Harrison home here?
Yes, we do have Benjamin Harrison's genealogy in our computer program, and we would welcome calls or emails from people who are interested in knowing more about the Harrison genealogy. I will say there is a charge for it, and you have to understand that we are keeping the records for direct descendants, so that we don't have a lot of information about distant cousins.
Let's have you come back out into the hallway and then into Mamie's bedroom as we take a call. Little Rock, Arkansas, you're next.
Hello. According to Burke, the Taylor family caused us to have 5 presidents. The 2 Harrisons, John Tyler, Madison, and Zachary Taylor. The last 2 I'm a direct descendant of. Do you know any of the relationship between these 5 presidents?
Professor Calhoun is on the set with us. Do you know any relationship between those 5?
Nothing other than the relationship between Harrison and his grandfather, I'm afraid.
How about you, Phyllis Geeslin?
I know that there are many people who believe that you can actually trace them all back to a King of England. So I suppose if you dig long enough, you're going to find a connection.
Now, there is somewhat of a political dynasty that moves on into the generations. Weren't you mentioning that there's some descendants of the Harrison family that then intermarried with other descendants of presidents' families?
That's true. In fact, Elizabeth's family...
And Elizabeth was who?
Elizabeth is Mary Lord and Ben's daughter. That's the youngest daughter. And she... Elizabeth married James Blaine Walker, so they were related to the Blaines, the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And then her daughter married Garfield, so they are also related to President Garfield.
Show us the room you're in now.
We're in Mary McKee's bedroom, the daughter's bedroom, and we're standing in front of the portrait of Anna Sims Harrison.
Who was that?
Anna Sims Harrison was William Henry Harrison's wife, and she was quite an interesting and educated woman.
So this would have been Benjamin Harrison's grandmother.
That's right. And she lived at North Bend. Ben would visit William Henry and Anna at their home, and they allowed him to go into their library and read books, which he absolutely loved. After William Henry died, Anna Sims moved in with Benjamin Harrison and his family, and I think she was quite an influence in his growing up.
Looking around that room, is that a fairly common kind of bedroom for the era?
I think so. I think it is.
You have some pictures over there in the corner to show us?
We have a picture of the grandchildren riding in a goat cart on the White House lawn, which is fun.
What's a goat cart?
Well, they had a goat named Whiskers, and they would hook him up to a little wagon, and he would pull them around on the White House lawn. There is a picture of the death scene of William Henry, and in this room we have quite a bit of William Henry memorabilia. We have his walking stick beside the fireplace, and we have a little boot jack that he made and gave to Benjamin when he was a little boy.
Now, if you walk through this house, you're going to see a lot of walking sticks. Why?
It was the fashion of the time. It wasn't because people needed something to hold them up. It was because it completed your outfit, just like gloves or a hat or a scarf. All the gentlemen carried walking sticks. It was a wonderful gift for somebody to give you, and some of them were very fancy.
We'll have you move on into Carolyn's sitting room, and a place where we have some of her outfits next as we take a call from Des Moines, Iowa. Hello.
Good morning. Speaking as a fifth grade elementary school teacher, I do compliment the series for not only teachers but certainly students. Two quick questions. I'm curious about the political lineage of Russell, the son. Did he himself involve himself into politics, Republican politics, or did he go into office holding, or exactly what happened to Russell?
Professor Calhoun, do you know?
I don't believe that Russell did engage in political activity after his father's career was over. He was a Republican and supported the party, I'm sure, but I don't believe that he held any offices.
Phyllis Giesland?
I think he was just marginally involved on the sidelines. I'm sure he was always interested in it, but some of his descendants have served in Congress.
Let's take a look at where you are now, which is what?
We're in the sitting room. This is where Caroline Harrison painted each day. Her easel is in the corner. Her White House portrait is on the wall. That is a reproduction of her White House portrait. And because Caroline was the first President General of the DAR, you will see on her lapel of her dress the DAR President General pin.
They were married 39 years. How, Charles Calhoun, how important was the DAR position that she held?
Well, it was very important. This was a time when patriotic societies were being formed by men, and there were women in the country who thought that there is no monopoly on patriotism by men in the country, and so they thought it one of the ways in which women could demonstrate their patriotism, support of the country and its government, was through the creation of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they prevailed upon, the leaders of this movement prevailed upon Mrs. Harrison to become the first President General. Now, of course, as First Lady, she did not have time to truly administer the body, so she said yes, she would be happy to do that as long as there were an assistant appointed to help her out. But having said that, we should also note that she allowed the DAR, indeed helped the DAR to use the facilities of the White House for meetings, for receptions, and that sort of thing. So she very much assisted in launching that organization.
Phyllis Giesland, we talked earlier about style. Was Caroline, the president's wife, stylish?
Very, and she had a wonderful dressmaker and made beautiful things. I think one of the most interesting things is that she supported her husband's platform politically by having her inaugural gown made in America of American silk and designed by an American designer.
Was this unusual for the period?
Oh, I think she was probably the first lady not to buy her gown in Paris. The gown that we're featuring in this room today was worn to the inaugural parade by Mary Harrison McKee, Benjamin Harrison's daughter, and we actually have a photograph of her wearing this outfit that day, which is hanging on the wall.
Phyllis Giesland, we'll let you move on into the bedroom. Professor Calhoun.
I just wanted to point out that about midway through the presidency, after the McKinley tariff had been passed, a very high tariff, Mrs. Harrison was on a shopping trip to New York and was looking at some imported goods, and she was a little bit surprised at the price. And the shopkeeper apparently said, "Well, Mrs. Harrison, it's the McKinley tariff." And I think this appeared in a Democratic newspaper. It may be apocryphal, but it made for a good political ploy.
San Diego, hello.
Yes, hello. A little bit more important for women than the DAR. This was a period of great activity by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other suffragists. And I would like to know what President Harrison's stand was on the women's right to vote.
Professor Calhoun.
Well, he did not come out foursquare for it in his public papers as president. One would not put him in the forefront of that movement. During his administration, Wyoming was admitted to the Union, and the territory of Wyoming, which had been organized a couple of decades earlier, had permitted women the right to vote. So it does occur to a limited degree in Wyoming.
I'm sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
Well, another point about women in this period that I think is worth noting as far as Mrs. Harrison is concerned, this is around the time that the Johns Hopkins University Medical School was created, and Mrs. Harrison was prevailed upon to help raise funds and have events at the White House to get the medical school launched. She said, "Well, I'll do that, but only if you are willing to admit females to the medical school." And so in her quiet way, she struck a blow for women's participation.
Where are you now, Phyllis Giesland?
I'm in the master bedroom. I would just add one thing to the question, or to the answer, and that is that Edmund Brock, the editor of Ladies' Home Journal, encouraged Benjamin Harrison to write a series of articles talking about the government that he hoped women would read and therefore be prepared to make an intelligent vote. So in a small way, Ben, I guess, did contribute to the women's movement.
What's that quilt?
The quilt is a centennial celebration quilt, Harrison being the president 100 years after George Washington, and we assume this was given to him in New York when he went to New York to reenact the Washington inauguration.
Was it a big deal to be the centennial president?
It was a very big deal, and the parties and the ceremonies and the parades were all extremely exciting, and it was sort of just a rallying of the country, and certainly a renewal of patriotism.
Back to the top hat, to the style issue, I see the top hat on the bed.
Oh yes, and his beautiful leather box with red satin lining that he kept it in.
What else is in the room? I know you have some photos.
We have some photographs of the children, and a photograph which has been painted of his oldest children in the corner over here. That is Russell and Mary McKee.
That's from the first marriage.
And then on the little table is a picture of Elizabeth, the youngest daughter.
Just below that, if we can go down to the little photograph right there. There she is. That's the daughter of in the second marriage.
That's right.
And we had asked earlier when she died. Do you happen to know?
Yes, she died in 1955. Her mother died in 1948.
So she's only been dead 40, 44, 45 years or so.
Right.
Well, how did the president stay in shape, or did he stay in shape, was the question.
I'm not sure that he stayed in shape, but he did try. And we see in the bedroom an item called the Whitney Home Gymnasium. These were built in New Jersey or Buffalo, New York, and this was given to Harrison in the White House. It needed to be secured to the wall so you could work the pulleys, but other than that, it's very much what we do today when we exercise, lifting weights and pulling pulleys. And I think that the Indian clubs may be a little unusual in that they did some kind of patterns with them, with their arms, and of course they could have different weights of Indian club.
Boston, you're next. Good morning, Boston.
Good morning. How are you today?
Great.
Okay, I have two questions. First to Miss Phyllis Gleason. Miss Gleason, do you know where are the trousers of President William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison? And my second question to the history professor is that was William McKinley vice president, or was he in charge of the public relations with Benjamin Harrison?
Caller, you're going to have to help us out a little bit on that first question. I didn't quite understand it. Where the trousers are?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Which trousers?
Well, the clothing they wear, you know.
Okay, in general.
I can just say that generally we have a few items. In fact, we think that we own Benjamin Harrison's vest that he wore for his wedding. It was quite decorated, and we have fewer pieces of his clothing than we do of Caroline's.
The second question regarding McKinley.
William McKinley was never vice president of the United States. During the Harrison administration, during the first half of it, he was a congressman from Ohio, had been a congressman for several years, but that Congress, he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and it was in that position that he was the chief architect of this tariff we've been talking about, the McKinley Tariff Act.
Benjamin Harrison made one Supreme Court appointment during his administration, David Brewer, who served on the court from 1889 to 1910. The other appointment that he made was one of the appointments that he made to a Civil Service Commission was Teddy Roosevelt.
Correct, and actually, Connie, he made 4 appointments to the Supreme Court.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, there were 4 justices he appointed. Brewer was one, Henry Brown, George Shiras, and Howell Jackson. Brown became somewhat controversial in that he was the one who wrote the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal decision. Howell Jackson was somewhat controversial in that he was appointed after Harrison lost to Cleveland, and Howell Jackson was in fact a Southern Democrat. And Harrison more or less believed similar views of the Constitution than Howell Jackson did, and so was willing to appoint him rather than leave it to his successor who had been elected, and because he was a Southern Democrat, he was confirmed. Teddy Roosevelt, yes indeed, he was appointed to the Civil Service Commission, and he served beyond the Harrison term into the Cleveland term. As he was in all of his offices, he was quite vigorous in that job, perhaps a little more vigorous than Harrison at times would have liked him to be.
Did they like each other?
Well, I think they respected each other at a distance. I think Teddy Roosevelt, in his impetuosity, would have expected the president to be a little more supportive of civil service reform than, in his judgment, Harrison was. But they got along reasonably well, and of course this was an important stepping stone in Theodore Roosevelt's political career.
Phyllis Giesland, again, people who want to come and visit this house, when can they come?
They can come 7 days a week. We're open daily from 10 until 3:30.
And what kind of tours do you get?
We give tours of the house. They are guided tours, and it's $5 for adults, $4 for seniors. Students are $1, and preschoolers are free.
And you mentioned earlier that you can help people out with some genealogy.
That's true. And of course, today we have birthday cake for everyone that comes to the house and free tours.
Birthday cake because of his 166th birthday.
Right.
Thank you so much for letting us come in and all of the assistance from you and your staff here. We appreciate it very much.
Well, it was fun for us, and you were wonderful to come.
We will take our next call from Germantown, Maryland. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I want to also thank you for C-SPAN, which is the best channel on TV, and especially C-SPAN Radio, which is by far the best station on the radio. I love your American President series, and I didn't think that you could surpass your de Tocqueville series, but obviously you have. Mr. Calhoun, I hate to rain on your parade today, but I just couldn't let your comments on Wounded Knee stand. Mr. Benjamin Harrison was an officer and commander-in-chief of the Army, and he was responsible for the Army's actions under him. And in December of 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry disarmed a band of Indians, about 300 in all. And then they weren't convinced that they had disarmed them all, and they did a person-to-person search, and they separated the men from the children. And they performed a thorough search, and they found 2 additional rifles. And one Indian was hiding a rifle and supposedly gave off a shot, and that shot was fired, and the shot gave cause for the rest of the 7th Cavalry to butcher hundreds of men and women and children. Hundreds. The men and women were separated. Women and children were killed. The president is generally responsible for the actions of the Army. And not only were the Army officers not sanctioned for this event, over a dozen Congressional Medals of Honor were given to soldiers who performed in this 7th Cavalry massacre at Wounded Knee.
Germantown, thank you for the call. I think we got your point. Professor.
Well, I think the caller's point is well taken. The Commander-in-Chief is responsible for the troops in the field. It would be interesting to speculate as to how events would have evolved had he been present at the scene. I suspect it would have been somewhat different. But he's absolutely correct, and I thought I made the point earlier that I thought it was one of the least creditable events of his career that in his next annual message he more or less excused what had taken place.
Benjamin Harrison wrote 2 books, I think.
Correct. Phyllis mentioned earlier the Ladies' Home Journal articles. Mm-hmm. Those were soon afterward published as a book called This Country of Ours. And as Phyllis pointed out, it was designed to teach about the government, how it worked, with the side effect of instilling patriotism as well. The other book was called Views of an Ex-President, and that was a collection of some of his lectures. He gave a series of lectures on the Constitution out at Stanford University after his presidency, some of his other public speeches, and other writings that the second Mrs. Harrison edited into a volume.
One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit today before we wrap up is the impact of this state on American presidency and American politics. We're in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Tom Houston will be joining us in just a few moments to talk a little bit about the impact of Indiana politicians on the nation. We have an interview that he is going to that we're going to be airing on September 6th on Labor Day at 8 p.m. Eastern, looking at some of his memorabilia. We thought we might show you just a little bit of that interview, and then he'll be back to take your questions and calls along with Professor Calhoun as we look at the 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison.
Collectors are compulsive. I mean, it's not like you say, well, you've got this lovely room and you've got something on every wall, why don't you quit? I mean, it's like asking a drug addict, why don't you quit? I mean, you can't quit, not when there's something out there that's great that you don't have.
In the same area where your storage room is there are a bunch of posters around. What's that room?
Well, that room is intended to show the variety of material that is available in the political area, the different means of communication. I mean, there are fans. There's a pair of fans down there, for example, that show one has Benjamin Harrison and has Morton as running mate. Fans were a popular means of getting the message across. We have window decals, rally tickets, the textiles, their bandanas were a popular means of communicating. And then you have flags. I mean, they took the flag and put Douglas flag from 1860 that's got Dick Douglas's picture on it, but during the whole period from really starting in 1840, flags and use of the flag image was a popular means, and all this came about because they had these tremendous political occasions. I mean, you would come together. There's a broadside down there that's interesting from the 1840 campaign of a rally that is going to be held in I think it's in Dayton, in Ohio. And I mean, it's a 2-day or 3-day affair, and you brought the family, you loaded them up, you went to the community, and you had big eat-outs, and you had speeches, hours after hours of speeches. And people turned out for that. And that particular broadside is interesting because it announces that one of the speakers is going to be William Henry Harrison. Well, up until nearly the turn of the century, I mean, presidential candidates did not go out and speak at campaign functions. I mean, you'd hear about the front porch campaign. But Harrison, and he didn't go outside Ohio, but he did translate around Ohio, and here at this particular thing is announced he's going to give a speech. As far as I know, as I've been able to determine, I think that's the earliest, I don't know of an earlier campaign in which a presidential candidate actually got out and spoke on the hustings like that.
That complete interview September 6th on Labor Day at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Tom Houston joins us here in Indianapolis today to continue a little bit of a discussion about Indiana, the impact of Hoosiers on the presidency. What was it?
Well, we ran a lot of candidates. And
to win much?
We didn't. Well, Tom Marshall, who was vice president under Wilson, said of Indiana that we had more first-rate men of the second rank than any other state in the Union. And so I guess we ended up with the vice presidency. But if you look at American politics and adopt a 19th century view, which is unlike ours, that assumes that when you talk about American government, American politics, you're talking about the presidency. If you eliminate the presidency per se, Indiana's influence in the political life of the country in the 19th century was, in the early 20th century, was really quite extensive in terms of our influence in Congress and the political organizations that we put together.
A couple examples.
Well, if you look at just at the vice presidential nomination, the reason Indiana was important in the 19th century, politically important, was because it was one of 4 states that was deemed to be doubtful in the presidential election. And we were a strong two-party state. We're still a strong two-party state. And the odds were never clear as to either party could win. And the Republicans particularly needed to take 2 of the 4 states, doubtful states, to win the presidency. And Indiana, and 2 of the states, New York was one, Indiana, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So it's not, if you look at the Harrison campaign, I mean, in both instances, in 1888, 1892, you had the Indiana, New York, 2 doubtful states were provided to candidates. So Indiana, both in Republican and Democratic conventions, always had a candidate for the presidential nomination virtually every time. The Democrats and Republicans both produced vice presidential candidates. The attempt being to carry that homeboy network would help carry Indiana for the state. And Harrison carried Indiana in 1888 and won. He lost Indiana in 1882 and he lost. 1892. Right.
Next is Annapolis. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
I'm calling, first of all, I wanted to ask about President Harrison's youngest daughter. I was wondering if she was still living, and I know that was rather late in life for him to have a child, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And I was also wondering, had the president ever met, was the president even born when his grandfather was president? And if not, I guess he did get to meet the President Harrison's wife, Mrs. Anna Harrison, who was his grandmother, and if she had some influence on him. And also, I have done quite a bit of research on First Ladies, and the thing that sticks out in my mind about Mrs. Harrison was how much she was so very, very, very up campaign slander that typically goes on. Things that were said about the Harrisons. She was just very devastated about it. She took it very personally and was very offended by it. And I do remember hearing that, and also the fact that she was a little bit ahead of her time, maybe as First Lady, because she actually was very active despite ill health. She was involved as the president of the Daughters of American Revolution, and I think with her causes and things, she may have been a little bit ahead of her time. I've never been to the Harrison home, but during my research, they sent me a cookbook with Mrs. Harrison's recipe for sausage rolls, which I really enjoyed. And
you recommend them, huh?
If they have that, and it also is printed in the First Lady's cookbook, which is put out by the National Geographic.
Thanks very much, Annapolis. We determined earlier the youngest daughter died in 1955. This was the daughter from the second marriage, and he talked a little bit about that being late in life for Benjamin Harrison, her birth.
Right. The ex-president was 63 years old when she was born, and she was a delightful child. At least she certainly looks that way, and from her photographs and all the reports we have, and I'm sure it made his latter years happy.
Did Benjamin Harrison know his grandfather, William Henry Harrison?
He did. He lived very near him. His father had a farm very near his grandfather's farm, and so he did know him. He was 7 years old when he went to the White House.
Do we know whether Carolyn Harrison, how she felt about campaigning?
Well, she assisted the president in the nominee in the 1888 election, holding receptions and that sort of thing. But the caller is correct that she very much was distressed by the fishbowl atmosphere at the White House. We know a lot about the baby McKee showing up in the newspapers and that sort of thing, and that distressed her. In fact, there's an interesting, very funny letter in a sense that she wrote to a friend soon after they took up residence in the White House. She said, well, one advantage is I don't have to write many letters to my friends because they can read all about us in the newspapers. It's the one plus she felt she had.
Tom Houston, do you think any of that was because she's a Midwesterner?
Well, I don't think, I find it hard to believe that she was as sensitive as being suggested. Politics in the 19th century was a rough business. Benjamin Harrison was in that business. He wanted to be in that business, and he could be as tough as anybody on the hustings taking on the opposition and doing such in a way that suggested that they lacked certain character traits that he thought was desirable. But I think that there was a lot of ridicule, Harrison's personally, against his size, and the diminutive size and the grandfather's hat. But it was a rough business, and I can't believe that she, as a politician's wife, thought it was going to be anything much different.
We said 5'6", is that correct, as terms of his height? When did you start collecting political memorabilia?
1952.
Why?
Eisenhower camp. I don't know the answer to that, really. Dick Nixon came, I lived in Logansport. It was a railroad town in the northern part of the state. That was when we still had campaigns on trains that were for real. And 48, Harry Truman came through on his train. In 1952, Dick Nixon came through as vice presidential nominee. And my father took us to both. And at 52, I grabbed a Nixon sign off the ground that had fallen out and held it up to him on the back of the train, and he signed it, and that became the first item in my collection.
You went on to work for him?
Yes.
What did you do for him?
I started out as a speechwriter, and I was in the counsel's office. I was associate counsel.
Next, Bethesda. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for a wonderful series. I had a question and a comment. My comment is that I grew up in Indianapolis and attended the Arthur Jordan Conservatory of Music, which at that time was right next door to the Harrison Mansion there. I think it's been torn down now because I can't see it, but a caller did ask about this earlier. I did not live, the Harrison Mansion was used as a dormitory, a girls' dormitory, just part of the back of the house and the upstairs. And I visited the Harrison Mansion only once, and that was as a guest of my friends who lived in this dormitory. This was in the 1940s. So
Professor Calhoun, can you confirm that that was a dormitory?
Absolutely, that's correct.
I'm sorry, caller, your question.
Oh, I say now that I find out that Elizabeth Harrison lived until 1955 and was a violinist, this explains probably maybe somewhat of her interest in music may have had something to do with that. It was a very, very beautiful place for these girls to live, and it was just a lovely area to go to school. I had a question about Mr. Harrison's education. Did he have a law degree? And then how did he happen to settle in Indianapolis to practice law?
Professor Calhoun.
He did not have a law degree as we think of that today. In those days, it was typical for someone who wanted to go into the law to read law, as it were, with a practicing attorney, usually attaching himself to an attorney's office, maybe a partnership office as a clerk, and he would read all of the appropriate volumes of the law that he would then be questioned on before admittance to the bar. How he came to move to Indianapolis, he was reading law in Cincinnati with Bellamy Storr, who was a prominent Ohio attorney, and when he was nearing the completion of his studies, he and Caroline sat down and sort of talked about where it would be good to settle, where he could launch a career with some hope of success without a whole lot of competition. Cincinnati he could stay, but there were already lots of lawyers. That was a pretty well-established river town. He hit upon Indianapolis. Indianapolis was about 16,000 people at that time. There were lawyers present, of course, and Harrison arrived, very young man, barely over 21 years old, launched his legal career, and it was pretty tough to begin with. Mrs. Harrison was pregnant at the time, and in fact she went back to Ohio with family because they really couldn't live in a safe fashion for a pregnant woman in those days. So she went back to Ohio to have the baby, and he went hunting for law business. After about a year, he had a lucky break and formed a partnership with the son of a former governor, and launched from that a very, very lucrative career.
Indianapolis and Indiana politics during that period?
Well, that was closely related to the law in that period, and his law partner, Wallace's father, had been governor, which didn't hurt in seeking out a business, and it was highly partisan. But it's important, I think, that Harrison was a brilliant lawyer and went on to really achieve great things. He was the first president. He was the first president of the Indiana State Bar Association was formed. This is after he left the presidency. But he was widely regarded in the state as being one of our most preeminent attorneys, and he was often called upon to be of counsel to other attorneys around the state, which helped expand his influence around the state so that he got to know the lawyers. The lawyers in those days rode circuit, and literally in horseback they rode from around to the county courts. Every county didn't have a judge. We had circuit, so the judge would ride with the lawyers, usually the plaintiff's lawyer and the defendant's lawyer, and the judge, the three of them with the horse up, and they'd ride from town to town, and so you developed a sense of camaraderie there that was a strong influence within the bar. And they campaigned the same way in those days. Schuyler Colfax, who was vice president under Grant, was Speaker of the House of Representatives from South Bend District. He ran against David Turpie, who was a senator from Indiana after the Civil War. And Turpie, in his autobiography, talks about how they used to ride together from little town to little town, and they'd go in each of these little communities and have their own debates. And so while politics was fiercely partisan and at a personal level, these people had warm personal relationships often, and it wasn't the kind of what you call gotcha politics that you see today.
We're going to see a lot of your collection on September 6th when we're going to air an interview with you at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You brought just a few things with you today. I'm going to ask you to get them out while we take a call. Next is Jacksonville, Florida. Hello.
Hello. My great-grandfather, his name was Ananias Smith. He was a miller who lived near Lexington, Virginia. And on March the 25th, 1888, he had a son, and he named him Benjamin Russell Harrison Smith. And later in June, my grandfather caught the C&O Railroad and went through Cincinnati and went up to Chicago to the convention that the Republicans had. And my question is that Benjamin Harrison's full name? Is it Benjamin Russell Harrison?
Professor Calhoun.
Benjamin Harrison was his full name. I might add as a footnote to that, my grandfather was born in 1891 when Benjamin Harrison was sitting in the White House. His last name was Johnson, and his parents were from southern Indiana, ardent supporters of the president, and so he was named William Harrison Johnson.
So, but that I can't think begs the question, what was the perception of Benjamin Harrison at the time, and what has been the perception of him by 20th century historians? Or
Well,
21st century, sorry, I guess
right.
today's historians.
Well, I think that his perception at the time, as is true in any political atmosphere, sometimes became distorted. We've talked about the cartoon showing him that he didn't fit his grandfather's hat and so forth, but that's part of politics. I think those who were certainly in his camp believed that he did an effective job as president, as a legislative president who worked reasonably well with Congress. Sometimes he didn't get along terribly well with the political bosses, people like Tom Platt and Matt Quay, especially once the administration was launched and he couldn't satisfy quite all of their patronage requests. It's an interesting thing to remember about Harrison. He is the first Republican president since Lincoln to take over the presidency from a Democrat. So we've got all those Democrats in office, Republicans out of office are hungry for it. Nobody could have satisfied all those patronage requests. So somebody once said, when you make an appointment, you make one friend and 19 enemies if there are 20 applicants. So it's tough. But people who followed his career, who were close to him, noted that he was a very hard worker. His secretary, Elijah Halford, who had been with the Republican paper here in town, went to Washington as his private secretary, later wrote reminiscences of him, cataloging what a really hard worker he was. And
That's
how
because he would
seriously-
take long walks with him, wouldn't he?
He did take long
The secretary
walks with him,
would-
yeah.
Who was the vice president under Harrison?
Levi Morton, who
Who
was
was he?
from New York. He was a New York banker, very wealthy.
Why was he chosen?
Because he was from New York. And Tom Platt and his organization had originally looked like they were trying to push Blaine in 1888. Blaine, who had been the nominee the preceding term, 1844, equivocated and indicated he wasn't going to run. And so Platt finally let New York go with Harrison in the nomination. And so part of the consideration was to get somebody who was acceptable to the New York thing. New York was split. The Republican Party was split in factions. But Morton was the nominee. And when Harrison was renominated, Harrison wanted Morton for a second term. But Platt got his vengeance. He had split with the president and forced Whitlaw Reid on the ticket as vice president, who had his own labor troubles, so he didn't do the president any favors.
What do you have there?
Well, this is we've talked about the grandfather's hat and how it was used against Harrison, but this is a ribbon from the 1892 campaign when Reid was the nominee. It makes use of that theme, but it reverses it, and what it does is show Harrison taking his hat and he's covered the Democratic rooster. And under the hat's the Democratic rooster who is being closed down by Harrison. And then you see the little metal attachment at the top is the grandfather's hat. It's a tin plate which tied into the tariff schedules. That was a dispute. And then it's got protection there. So it's a good example of how you take a factor, something's being used against you, and you reverse it and try to work it to your advantage.
Which was exactly what was done in the log cabin campaign with his grandfather.
And that was what?
Well, the original screed in some newspaper said, well, this guy's just, living in some log cabin and drinking hard cider on the banks of the Ohio. And the Whigs said, what a wonderful idea. That'll appeal to the people, and they used it. And we have the most famous slogan as a result.
Newburyport, Massachusetts. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for taking my call. I'm really enjoying the series. And coincidentally, my comment ties in with the discussion you're having, because I had read a comment by Samuel Eliot Morrison, the historian, who said that Harrison's administration could just as well have been called the administration from Maine. And you've already talked about James Blaine, but I believe Thomas Reed was the Speaker of the House, very powerful speaker, and there were several other congressmen who held powerful positions who were from Maine. And I believe the Chief Justice at the time was also a man named Fuller from Maine.
Professor Calhoun?
Well, I'm glad that the caller mentioned Maine. Maine loomed large in our politics at that time. James G. Blaine was the Secretary of State, but he and Harrison actually didn't get along that well after a time in their years together, and Blaine eventually resigned just before the 1892 convention. Thomas Brackett Reed was Speaker of the House, a gigantic man. I think he stood about a foot taller than, not quite a foot taller than Benjamin Harrison, had a high, squeaky voice, brilliant mind, and to a great degree, the successes that Harrison achieved legislatively with the 51st Congress, Thomas Brackett Reed could take credit for, because what happened was that when the House met for the first time early in December and on into December 93 on into 89 into January 90, it was a fairly close match between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans had a slim majority, and what the Democrats decided to do to frustrate business was to engage in a time-honored obstructionist tactic called the disappearing quorum. They would simply participate in debate, and then when it was time to vote, they would simply keep their mouths shut, and under the rules that this was acceptable, they were not counted as present. That meant that there was no quorum. You couldn't conduct business. What Reed did was to say, we're going to count you as present. We're going to say you're here, and therefore we do have a quorum. James McCurry from Kentucky stands up and says, wait a minute, Mr. Speaker, I dispute your right to count me as present. Reed shoots back, had a wonderful wit, said, the gentleman from Kentucky is present. Does he deny the fact? I mean, you're here, your body is here, and so we're going to go ahead and conduct business. This ruling was later adopted into a new set of official rules for the House, and it helped pave the way for some achievements.
Amy Gossett works at this House, and we want to thank her very much for all her help in making this happen, along with Phyllis Giesland. And President Harrison is buried at the Crown Hill Cemetery, correct? Where is the Crown Hill Cemetery, Tom Houston?
Well, it's northwest from here. It's probably 4 miles from here.
What's the
It was
grave?
outside the city at the time. It was a fairly large jump, but it is the where we have a. If you want, some people say the best politician is a dead politician. You want to find him, you can go to Crown Hill, because they're
There he is, lawyer and publicist, is what it says on his gravestone. Who else is buried there?
Well, Vice President Hendricks is buried. I think is buried there. Fairbanks is there. Tom Marshall is there. Senator Kern, who was a vice presidential candidate, is there. Of course, James Hook and Riley is out there, which is he has the highest point in the real estate. So
You can see there the gravestones of both of the president's wives are buried alongside him, and that would have been the oldest son, correct? What kind of impact did the fact that Benjamin Harrison lost the popular vote, but then won the electoral vote, what did that have on him, did that have on him as a person?
I don't think it had much of an impact at all, except that it confirmed some of his ideas about the South. The reason that was the case was that the Democratic candidate, Grover Cleveland, racked up huge majorities in many southern states where blacks were essentially excluded from the franchise. And that accounts for when you look at the national total, Cleveland actually coming in with a higher vote. In the contested states like New York and Indiana, those votes are very, very close. Harrison won them close, New York and Indiana, by a close vote, and some of the other states he won in the North were by fairly close votes. So it's that anomalous situation in the South that permits Cleveland to rack up such a large majority. And so I don't think Harrison, if the purport of your question is, gee, did he feel that people didn't really want him to be president? I don't think so. I think it confirmed his notion that we need to do something about the vote in the South.
Did that happen at any other presidency? Presidential election?
Yes, as a matter of fact, under different kinds of circumstances.
Oxford, Mississippi, you're next. Hello.
Yes, good morning. I have a question about the 1892 election. I was wondering if you thought that the unpopularity of James G. Blaine and Thomas Brackett Reed contributed to Harrison's loss in 1892, or if it was the intervention of a third-party candidate from the Populist Party.
Professor?
That's an interesting question. I don't think that I would, or most historians would say that it was Harrison or Blaine or Reed's unpopularity. In fact, I think there were party people who said those people are certainly more popular than Benjamin Harrison. It isn't too bad that, say, a man like Blaine wasn't nominated. So I don't think that would have been a factor.
Tom Houston, you have something? I'm sorry, you want to say something about that, but you got another something for us to share.
Let me just say on
Sure.
that point that I think that after the convention, Blaine was not a factor. I mean, he was a dying man. He didn't survive long after the election, and so I don't think that was a factor. Yeah, I wanted to. This is an example of one of the interesting things about the what I call the artifacts of political campaigning is the broad variety, and this is a Buckeye, which, of course, if you're from Ohio or Indiana,
What's a Buckeye?
Buckeye is the nut of a tree, a Buckeye tree, and the very important when you're a young kid in Indiana. We used to have a game equivalent of baseball with Buckeyes. But some supporter of Harrison here has hand-painted on this Buckeye across flags and Harrison and Morton, and the detail is really incredible, but it suggests the way in which the involvement of people, ordinary voters, how committed they were, what efforts they went to support their candidate. Kind of the opposite end of that is this is an example of a higher tech, mass-produced item. This is a drum. A sort of drum that you would see in any campaign parade, torchlight parade, beating on the drum, and on one side you have a ferrotype of President Harrison, and on the other side you have a ferrotype of Whitlaw Reid, who was his candidate. And those would not be, by the standards of the time, inexpensive, but they were high-quality item used. So you have kind of a broad representation here of the interest that politics went down to the grassroots. It wasn't a passive spectator sport like we've seen it be today.
Number of items you have?
I really don't know, several thousand.
We'll see more of them again September 6th. Quincy, Massachusetts, our last call.
Good morning, Connie. How are you today?
Great.
Okay, I have a comment. First, I'd like to say my name is Syed, and I am a high school student. I'll be going to high school, and I really enjoy learning about history. And in fact, you know that I know every American history from the beginning till end, everything. And you can, if you want, any one of your guests can ask me any questions if they want. And my second question is that Professor Cullen, are you by any chance related to John C. Calhoun? He, I think, was a Secretary of the Navy, by any chance? Thank you.
Calhoun, yes.
John C. Calhoun was a senator from South Carolina, Vice President of the United States. So far as I know, I'm not related.
These are two books that our guest, Professor Calhoun, has written. They're both about the Gilded Age, which is a part of the period that we've been talking about, and you have another book that you're working on.
Correct.
Which is what?
It's a study of the ideology of the Republican Party in that period, the late 19th century.
When will it come out?
Probably in a year or year and a half.
And the publisher is?
University Press of Kansas.
We would also mention to our viewers that they might want to check out the C-SPAN in the classroom. Call us if you are a teacher and you would like to use the C-SPAN in the classroom. In your classroom, you can go to the website, cspan.org/classroom, or call us at 202-626-4858. If you're not a teacher and you just want to know more about our American Presidents series, go ahead and go to www.americanpresidents.org, and that is a place where you can get information about all the places that we've been to and some of the places that we're going to. And speaking of some of the places that we're going to, Monday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll be in Canton, Ohio, at the William McKinley National Memorial Museum. And then we'll be talking about our next president, William McKinley. That wraps up our program on our 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison. Our thanks to Professor Calhoun, our thanks to Tom Houston, and also to Phyllis Giesland for all their help here in the House. Have a good day.
Tomorrow night at 9 Eastern, C-SPAN